this interest in Sri Lankan food and being able to explain it to people and go, look at this, and then have people respond positively and go, oh, wow, it's really different to anything I've had, or it's really delicious. Like that's quite a privilege to be able to show people something that they've never had before and for them to enjoy it.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. The food of the subcontinent offers the most extraordinary spice trail, with influences from all corners using stunning ingredients and techniques that could take a lifetime to explore in detail. Sri Lanka has a fascinating history and cuisine, as intricate and varied as it is vibrant and colourful. But with so many influences, what is Sri Lankan cuisine? Tama Carey is the chef and owner of Lankan Filling Station in Sydney. Tama, how are you?
I am very good, thank you.
It's great to have you on the show. You took Sydney by storm with Lankan Filling Station. Firstly, the word that it was opening, and then when it did open, it was hard to get in. What's it been like delving into sort of the food of your family's cultural sort of background like this?
It's been amazing. Very different to anything I've done before. I had never, before I opened Lankan Filling Station, I'd never actually cooked Sri Lankan professionally. Hadn't actually really cooked Sri Lankan very much. I'd kind of, my mum cooked it really well, not all the time. I didn't grow up eating it every day or anything. It was, it was there, but it wasn't like what we ate on a daily basis. But I've spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka and, obviously having Sri Lankan food around, but I'd never really cooked it myself. And then I decided I needed a Sri Lankan restaurant because I decided the people needed to eat more Sri Lankan food. And so I had to very quickly teach myself how to do it.
Well, I think a lot of people did, and thank God you did, because it was extraordinary what you did create. What was it like for you delving into different recipes and techniques and immersing yourself in that world leading up to the opening?
So interestingly, I kind of felt a little bit, I've always felt that the Sri Lankan food stuff for me was a bit removed in terms of I was a chef, or I am a chef, and, I've cooked all sorts of different things, but the Sri Lanka food was kind of separate to that. But then once I went, okay, right, this is what I'm doing, it was like, obviously, I've been learning it for the last 20 years subconsciously, basically. So it was quite an easy, it was an easy thing to do from that, because I just realised I'd been travelling there for years and years and learning the food and bothering people about the recipes, and, I'd been eating that food. So I had all of this knowledge that it kind of all clicked into place quite nicely.
Well, take us back to when you were young. I know professionally you've cooked so many different cuisines, which we can get into, but take us back to when you were young. What sort of role did food play in your family?
I was one of those lucky ones who kind of grew up being surrounded by good food and people who wanted to eat food, and, families of very excellent cooks. So, but interestingly, I did not eat as a child. I refused to eat, was very uninterested in food. Didn't care for food. Couldn't go into butchers, like up until about the age of 15 or 16. I refused to go into a butcher or a fish shop because I thought they were stinky. Even though at the time I was working at the Adelaide Central Markets. So I kind of had, this immersive food stuff going on, but at the same time I kind of didn't really care for food. Mum said trying to feed me as a child was horrible. We actually spent, I think, about 6 months when I was about 2-ish in Sri Lanka. Mum went there for a big long stint and I was there with her for a while, and I ate nothing but rice and papadums and bananas. That was all I'd eat. Yeah. So I didn't, and then it was like the food for me, I kind of, even though I was surrounded by it all and, interesting things, not just like, Mum, we ate food from all over the place. And, there's lots of good Greek food in Adelaide. We always went to Asian restaurants where I would just hide under the table and ignore what was going on. But so I had like the knowledge around me, but I just didn't eat, really.
Well, when was the turning point? When did food become of interest to you?
I think it was kind of a gradual thing. There was a few moments. So when I was about 10, my best mate at the time in Adelaide, we came to Sydney because her dad lived here, her dad and her dad's partner, and that was Barry Ross and Phillip Sell, and we stayed. It was when they had Oasis Ceras on Oxford Street, and so we stayed, that's where they lived, so that was where we were staying. And I remember really distinctly going into the cool room of the restaurant because they didn't have a kitchen upstairs, so we just ate from the cool room of the restaurant when we weren't going out. And I remember just looking at this cool room going, oh, my God, that is amazing. And the other I think one of the other moments was when I was 14. I started working at the Central Markets in Adelaide, and I worked at a stall called Providore, which is still there, but very different to what it used to be. And it was kind of a gourmet food stall. I remember the first day I worked, looking into the freezer, and there were these whole skinned possums that we used to get for Chonglu. And so very rapidly, and they used to make beautiful stuff themselves. Providore had their own brand, and they made pâtés and olives, and we had fresh pasta. There were beautiful cakes, truffles, bread. They kind of gourmet food shop. Anyway, so I started working there, and I think that was probably a big influence. But we used to go to the markets every Saturday. That was how I got the job, because my mum bribed the owner with, I think, free theatre tickets and said, give my daughter a job, would you? And so, yeah, it was around that time that I think it was all those things influenced it.
Well, it's extraordinary for someone that didn't have an interest at all in food to create a career in food, and such a successful one. What was the first step into the industry for you?
It was purely by accident. It was a big mistake. It was, I had no leanings towards it. And then I went travelling like you do when you finish school, with no idea what I wanted to do. I think I still wanted to be an actress at that stage of my life. And I arrived so that was really important. So I travelled from Australia to Sri Lanka, and I went with my mum and a friend of mine. And that was, since I was a baby, that was the first time I'd been there. And we had a good 6 weeks there. And it was amazing travelling around with my mum. We saw family, we saw friends. I saw where she grew up. I ate so much food. My mum was shocked. She was like, I've never seen you eat so much food ever. And that trip was really significant. I mean, it was just incredible. It's such a beautiful place. And I felt really comfortable there as well. It felt, familiar in a way and comfortable, and I just loved it. And then from there, I went on my own to London, and the plan was to keep travelling, and I wanted to go up to Spain and travel around, but of course I had no money, even though I'd been planning this for ages. I had some, but not very much, so I knew I needed to get a job in London. And through a family friend who's one of my great friends, her partner used to be is a chef. Her ex-partner was a chef. Anyway, so she knew some people in the industry. And down the road from where she lived, there was a woman who had a restaurant, and she contacted her very roundabout way. I thought I was getting a job as a kitchen hand, but it was in the kitchen. And then that was it. And then I stayed. And it was crazy. And I didn't go. Never made it to Spain that trip.
When you came back to Australia, how different was it to the experiences you had over there in regards to food and immersing yourself in this industry here?
Well, I mean, when I was in London, it was just a bit of a, like, I was really young, and it wasn't a career for me. So it was just fun, and it was pretty outrageous. So it wasn't a serious thing for me. But what I was really aware of being in London was the knowledge that I had about food and about Asian food, but just about food in general, because it was pretty, like, London food scene it was a bit bleak back then, really. Like, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't around. Australia had, especially with the Asian stuff, Australia was miles ahead in terms of what we were doing. I mean, I remember telling the chef, talking to, like, saying I felt like laksa or something, and she was like, "What's laksa?" I was like, "Are you joking? What is this world that I'm living in?" And then we put it on, and I explained it to her, and she was like, "Put it on the menu." And I had to ring up my mum and go, "Mum, how do I cook laksa?" "I don't know," because I'd never cooked it before, of course. So that was really interesting. I suppose, like, looking back, I must have, for me, I just kind of fell into this job and I was just doing it. But looking back, I probably obviously was good at it then, because otherwise I would have got sacked. But I was good at it, and I think I had a lot of food knowledge just from osmosis, just from, life, because I had this life that was all about food without really knowing any different.
You've worked at some extraordinary restaurants in Australia, very different cuisines as well, with the French at Bistro Mon Coeur, Billy Kwong, and Italian as well with Berta. What did you get out of those cuisines and experiences?
Well, also, I mean, each of those jobs was really distinct for me and really, like, fundamental to my learning, because, I mean, I never went to TAFE, so I didn't have any formal training at all. And so when I ended up back in Australia, and eventually in the kitchen at Bistro Mon Coeur, I mean, one of the things that kitchen taught me was, how to be in a formal kitchen, because where I was in London was pretty loose. And so, Bistro Mon Coeur was amazing for the food. Then was just so delicious, and it taught me how to be in a kitchen. It taught me, the fundamentals of French cuisine, which I think is really important to learn and to know. And there are flavours from my time there, which I can still taste and which I still refer back to, like, such strong flavour memories. And I use, there's still recipes from there that I use, versions of, that I've folded into my repertoire of stuff. So that was really important. And then Billy Kwong was where I really decided that I wanted to be a chef and that I loved restaurants, because I'd fallen into this thing, and obviously I showed some aptitude to it, but it wasn't until I was there that I went, oh yeah, this is really what I want to do. And that was all about, it was about the produce, it was about the way the restaurant was run, it was about the people, it was about all of it, really.
It had an incredible alumni from Billy Kwong. What was it like working with Kylie?
Oh, Kylie's amazing. She's very passionate, which is just an incredible thing to witness. And, in terms of ingredients and produce and loving her job and it being this home for her and her friends and her staff, and, producing this amazing food. And what she was doing at that time was pretty incredible when you look around at what, has come after that, in terms of, people cooking that kind of, doing that Asian thing or food from your culture, but doing it in a way which is very Australian as well.
Do you have any stories from your time at Billy Kwong? There's just so many incredible chefs have come out of that tiny that tiny little establishment.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was there for nearly 5 years. And, the people who I worked with there, a lot of them are still some of my closest friends. I mean, Matthew Moo, he's my partner, and that was where we first met. And that was, almost 20 years ago now. So it was a really excellent group of people. Obviously there were peaks and troughs over 5 years, but there were moments there where there was just so much talent in that kitchen, and it was a joy to come to work, and it was so much fun. Like, being that busy and cooking delicious food and using beautiful produce, it's kind of the peak of what you really aim for, I suppose, in a restaurant. And we were there for it, and it was amazing.
Tell us about Berta, the transition from cooking Chinese food to an interpretation of Italian cuisine down a little laneway hidden away in the city. Berta was amazing, but what was it like for you as a head chef for the first time?
It was really good. I mean, so I left Billy Kwong and kind of didn't have anything lined up. So I had a couple of years out in the wild where I was just, helping out and doing some consulting and doing some parties and just doing bits and pieces. And one of the bits and pieces that I was doing was I started doing a few shifts at Vini, which was Andrew's first restaurant, because I used to go there for lunch and I lived around the corner. And I remember having a chat to him one day because I knew him because he, funnily enough, did a trial at Billy Kwong when he'd first got back from Italy before Vini. And so that's how I'd met him. And we'd offered him the job, but he was like, no, which was lucky because he went off and opened Vini. So I kind of knew, I didn't know him that well, but I knew him enough, and I was telling him my problems, like freaking out, like how I was going to pay my rent. And he kind of said to me, we can give you 2 shifts here a week if you like. And that was great because for me, just those 2 shifts gave me enough security to know I could pay my rent every week because I was living on my own. And, so that made it all a little bit easier. So I started doing bits and pieces there. Of course, he pulled me in and I ended up, I think Dan went away on holidays, who was the head chef, and I ended up having to work there for 6 weeks. And I kind of got more and more sucked in. But then it was when he was looking at the Berta site and thinking of opening another restaurant. And so a couple of years in, he kind of said, so I'd been hanging around Beanie for a bit, and then he told everyone that he was going to ask me if I wanted to run it, but he didn't ask me. So when he eventually got around to asking me, which is just a bit of a chibe thing to do, I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And he's like, it has to be Italian. And I was like, okay, I can do that. Me, of course, going, yeah, of course I can do that, fine. How hard can it be? But for me, Berta was just amazing in terms of cooking my own food and being the boss and just being able to cook whatever I wanted. And it was, I threw myself into it wholeheartedly. I read so many Italian books, cookbooks. I was lucky enough to go to Italy a couple of times with Andrew on wine buying things. So it was pretty full on, and we did the Sagra dinners, which were once a week. We would each week there was a new ingredient, and I'd base a whole dinner around that. So 3 or 4 antipasti, a mid-course, a primi, usually a pasta, main course and a dessert, and they were quite ridiculous. And I did a new one every week, and I changed the menu every week. And so it was just a roller coaster of just being completely absorbed into a restaurant and not being able to leave and not being able to do anything except constantly write menus, which was in terms of, creativity was incredible because I was forced into it. I just had to come up with new ideas all the time, which is incredible, but it did burn me out a little bit by the end.
You're now absorbed in the world of Sri Lankan food, and you even have a book out as well. Tell us a bit about Sri Lankan food from your perspective? I know it's hard to encapsulate in a podcast, but take us on a bit of a dive into the way that you see Sri Lankan food.
Well, so, I mean, growing up for me, the Sri Lankan food that I was eating was, look, there's this whole question of authenticity which gets bandied around, and, my nan was a really amazing Sri Lankan cook, but her Sri Lankan cooking was, obviously she grew up there and lived there. They left in the 70s. She had servants to cook a lot. I think she did cook, but, she wasn't doing everyday cooking. But then when she came to Australia, she was suddenly had to feed a family of 5 people. So they weren't, at the time, they weren't allowed to bring very much money over. I think the White Australia nonsense, don't know what happened, not much money. So they weren't poor, but they weren't really well off. So her Sri Lankan food that I knew growing up and tasting was it was very Sri Lankan traditional, but it was with what you could buy in Australia in the 70s, which was probably a bit grim. And also, feeding a family of 5 on not very much money. So I think that gets obviously wound into the ingredients you use and the style of cooking you do. And then my mum's Sri Lankan cooking was, based on her childhood memories as well. So I had that, and then I had, travelling to Sri Lanka and tasting the food there. So there's all these, just in my Sri Lankan world, there's a lot of different influences, but then you look at the country as a whole, and historically you look at all the influences they've had, and they've had the Dutch, they've had the Portuguese, they've had English, there's heaps of Chinese food there. I've got a great theory about Sri Lankan food being like Thai food in terms of balance and flavour, the freshness of Thai cuisine. But there's so much there, and that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, because I think, why would you know that? No one would know that, because why would you? You just, people want to know what Sri Lankan food is, but it's really hard to capture that easily because there's so many influences. Obviously it started in India, but then it's been layered upon layer, and it's this really distinct, for this tiny island, there's a really distinct flavour profile and cuisine and style that you don't get anywhere else. I suppose that's true for any country, but we're talking about Sri Lanka, so we can just talk about that.
Well, tell us a bit about Lankan Filling Station. Can you talk about the food or a dish or two that kind of exemplifies sort of what you're doing there?
So the first idea, so it started life as just a hopper shop, a really simple hopper shop, because hoppers they were one of my favourite things in Sri Lanka, and they're the bowl-shaped fermented rice flour pancake. You make them in a hopper pan, and they're really beautiful, lacy. They've got crispy edges. They've got a doughy middle. You can have egg ones or plain ones. The egg ones are just the same. It's just got an egg cooked in the base of it. And when you're in Sri Lanka, you either have them for breakfast or for dinner. They're kind of a bit of a street food. Like, they'll have hopper stalls on the side of the road where you can buy a pile of hoppers and take them home and eat them with curries that you've cooked at home. Everyone's got a different recipe for them. Everyone searches for the best hopper. People are very opinionated about hoppers. Some people like the crunchy, crispy outer bits. Some people like the doughy middle bits. They can be really delicate. They can be a little bit denser. And traditionally, more often than not, you eat them just with sambols. Like, if you go out, you stop at a hopper stall and they'll have hoppers and kata sambol, like one sambol, and that will be what you eat. And you just eat, you'll start with an egg hopper, then you'll just eat plain hoppers, and you'll just keep going. And that was what that was the centre of Lankan Filling Station. But then, of course, it grew into a restaurant because I needed to have martinis on the menu and all the curries. And stuff. So it is, the food is all based on family recipes and recipes I've learnt over there. In terms of technique, it's probably more, based on my knowledge of cooking, so it's a little bit different. But for the most part, we're pretty traditional, and I just wanted to, showcase. It's only like a tiny bit of Sri Lankan food. There's so much more, but we're just trying to show an array of some of the things you can have there. But then, using Australian ingredients and slightly different techniques because we're a restaurant in Australia.
Lankan Filling Station opened before the pandemic, but it's been a crazy couple of years for so many people. What sort of impact has it had on you?
Well, same for everyone, I think. It's been pretty full on. I mean, we were only open for just over a year before it happened. So anyone who's opened a restaurant knows that, that's not enough time to get your feet firmly on the ground. It's, that first 6 months is always crazy. And then by that year period, you're just slowly beginning to understand it. And then suddenly a pandemic hit and, it was bewildering for everyone, I think, especially that first bit that happened was very uncertain and pretty scary. And it's amazing how quickly a restaurant can go from having some money in the bank to just going, oh my God, what do I do? Like, it's pretty quick. So yeah, it's been the pandemic, it's thrown everyone, I think. And I think especially for restaurants, or for me, I don't know, for everyone, but that whole thing about having a restaurant is the vibrancy and the moving forward, and there's a certain energy in a restaurant that's very, it's, you move forward, it's exciting, it's noisy, there's people, it's always changing. And the thing that's got me this last kind of batch is that stagnation and not being able to move forward. Like even things like not being able to put specials on every night or changing the menu and all of that stuff we kind of had to pull back on because we had to pull back on everything because otherwise we wouldn't survive. Like you can't put a special on when you've got 40 people in the restaurant and 2 people are going to order it and then you just throw the rest of it out. Like, there's practical business things that you have to pull back on to survive, but they're the kind of things that make the restaurant exciting, So yeah, it was tricky, but we survived so far. Touch wood.
What sort of impact has the last couple of years had on you personally? Has there been challenges and a different perspective on sort of what you do and life?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's been a very full-on couple of years. So there was a pandemic, which was pretty exciting, and my partner has restaurants as well. So there were lots of restaurants to worry about. So we spent a lot of time on the phone. There was the book, that was really big, writing the book. That takes a lot of time and energy. And then we were also pregnant and we really sadly had a stillbirth at 38 weeks. So, there was all the excitement of, having a baby and getting the restaurants ready for us to not be there and then not working and then all of that grief, which happens and is still happening, which is really tricky to deal with. So, yeah, the last couple of years have been pretty full on, but not, I mean, it's still been amazing. Like there's still been lots of amazing things, but it has been hard and continues to be hard in amongst it all.
What's given you strength and helped through this period of time?
Matthew, my partner. He's been really amazing. My staff have been incredible. Through all of it, through like pandemic and through this kind of grieving period, they've just been fantastic. when the pandemic happened, you know, and there was all that uncertainty. And then we had to come back, and then we had to, you know, keep changing, and it'll be like, okay, this week we can have 10 people, we're doing takeaway, we're changing what we do, let's put stuff in jars, you know, and everything, every step of the way, whatever I kind of said to them, they were like, yep, we'll do it. Yep, we're happy to do it. Yep, we just want to be working, you know. So that just made it, you know, because when you run a business, there's all these people you're really responsible for in terms of, you know, you want to keep the business alive, but, you know, a big part of it is also wanting to make sure you have staff, which we don't have at the moment. If anyone's listening and wants a job, please call me. But you want, you know, you're responsible for people's lives. And, you know, they were very positive. And I can imagine it would be much harder if you were dealing with people who didn't really want to come to work. So that was incredible. And then when my baby died, they were also really, you know, amazing and helpful, and just kind of I just felt really supported by them.
One of the amazing things that have happened in the last couple of years for you is the popularity and success and interest in what you've created at Lankan Filling Station. Has the interest and success of it and understanding of it surprised you?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's been well received, but it's always very bewildering when you stand in a restaurant and you have quiet nights and you go, am I doing the right thing? And then someone goes, oh, it's the best meal I ever have. And you go, oh, that's excellent. And then you get a review where it says the portions are small and it's too expensive. And then you go, oh. And then the next day you have someone say, it's so authentic. It's like my grandma used to cook. And then someone else goes, oh, it's Sri Lankan food for white people. So it's a topsy-turvy world. I don't know if anyone sits back and feels, I certainly don't ever sit back and go, wow, I'm so popular and my restaurant's so good. I think in a day I certainly have moments where I waver between, I love my restaurant, it's amazing and the best, and oh my God, we're never going to survive. And that kind of happens on a daily basis. So, but I think the fact that we're still there gives me hope.
Well, it's amazing what you've created there. That's one of the things I miss about not being in Sydney anymore, actually, is your food and what you've created. What is it that you love about what you do?
Oh, I love all of it. I love cooking. I love making delicious food. I love restaurants. I love that feeling of being in a restaurant and, you know, welcoming people and having that buzzy feeling of people eating and drinking and being happy. I love that whole thing about hospitality and how, you know, you can make someone have a beautiful meal or a beautiful night and a beautiful experience. Yeah, I love all of it. I love working with good producers and talking about nice food, like talking about nice produce. I've even been doing a lot of floor shifts, and I won't go as far as to say I love it, but there's something nice about it. You know, it's been really good. I'm not going to take it up as a career, but I love, you know, it's fun being on the floor and talking to the people and explaining the people. And the thing for me that's really great is, you know, this interest in Sri Lankan food and being able to explain it to people and go, look at this, and then have people respond positively and go, oh, wow, it's really different to anything I've had, or it's really delicious. Like that's quite a privilege to be able to show people something that they've never had before and for them to enjoy it. I think that's, you know, that's pretty special. And I love having a team of people who I work with, not all the time because sometimes they're pesty, but having a team of people who, you know, you can work with and work together and who get excited as well for this project it's really fun. I just love it.
Well, Tama, it's an absolute honour to have you on Deep in the Weeds today to hear a bit of your story. Lankan Food is out now at all good bookshops. Please keep in touch, and I would love to catch up again soon.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.